When did humans enter Palestine? We do not know for certain. There is no definitive evidence. However, many indications and traces suggest that the first inhabitants settled in Palestine in the 14th century BCE, from 14,000 to 8,000 BCE. We are talking about more than 10,000 years ago. Tribes called the Sufian left traces, but their origins and identity remain unknown. Nevertheless, these are the earliest traces indicating the presence of humans in Palestine, and there may have been people who inhabited Palestine before them, but their traces have not been discovered yet. In 8000 BCE, archaeological evidence suggests the beginnings of a city, specifically in Jericho, making it the oldest city in the world. It has the oldest known remains of a city. However, it remained a rudimentary settlement rather than a fully developed city. Prior to that, people were nomadic. The first buildings, even if simple, appeared in Jericho around 8000 BCE, marking the start of settled life in Palestine. Buildings began to emerge here and there, but it is unknown who built them or who were the first inhabitants. The Canaanites and the Amorites were the first known settled people in Palestine. They entered Palestine from the Arabian Peninsula, migrating from the Arabian Peninsula. They moved north and settled in Palestine. This is a historical fact that the Canaanites and the Amorites were the first to settle in Palestine. Therefore, the beginning of Palestine and the establishment of settlements in Palestine did not belong to the Jews until centuries later. The first settlements were established by Arab tribes who migrated from the Arabian Peninsula to Palestine. They divided into different groups, including the Canaanites who settled in the plains of Palestine and the Jebusites who settled in the Jerusalem area. Jerusalem was not built, but their settlement began in those areas. The Phoenicians and the Amorites settled in the mountains, marking the beginning of clear migration and human settlement in Palestine. That is why historians and archaeologists refer to those lands as the land of Canaan. This is also mentioned in religious books, including the Torah and the Gospel. It was never referred to as the land of the Jews or the land of Israel. Where were the children of Israel in Palestine after several centuries? The first beginning of Arab tribes immigrating there and settling there is mentioned in all historical books as the land of Canaan. Of course, languages changed over time. Initially, the language of the people of paradise, as mentioned in the stories of the prophets, and the first language spoken by Adam, peace be upon him, was the Arabic language, which is the language of the angels. But with time, tongues began to change, and people changed in their languages. This is one of the signs of Allah Almighty, the diversity of languages and colors. Tongues changed, and they did not speak the Arabic language, but certainly, they were not Jews or from the children of Israel. If someone wants to trace the matter back thousands of years ago, the reference goes back to ancient history, which indicates that they were from the Arabian Peninsula and started establishing cities near Al-Aqsa Mosque. Of course, you know that after Jacob, Joseph, peace be upon him, came. But Joseph, peace be upon him, in his famous story was taken as a slave to Egypt and settled there. Then you know how his situation evolved until he became the vizier of Egypt, meaning the minister who controlled Egypt. In the famous story, he said, "Give me your family." So the children of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, peace be upon him, migrated from Palestine and moved to Egypt, where they settled for several centuries. The presence of the children of Israel in Palestine ceased. It is true that they built the temple, but they left this place and migrated to Egypt, where they resided for several centuries. Of course, after Joseph, peace be upon him, the Egyptians enslaved the children of Israel and they became slaves to them. They were marked and used for building the pyramids and monuments. They were the servants, they were the slaves. So, taking advantage of their absence after the glory they had during the days of Joseph, peace be upon him, if the Jews, the children of Israel, were no longer present, they had no existence in Palestine. Instead, their presence lasted for several centuries in Egypt. Palestine continued to be inhabited and occupied by the people of Palestine, the Japanese. These Arab Japanese who came from the Arabian Peninsula were the ones who were in Palestine. Let us pause here. Firstly, Abraham, peace be upon him, migrated, and this land was not his land, and his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, peace be upon them, were indeed born there. However, Ishmael left and went to Mecca, as you know, and Isaac, peace be upon him, remained in Palestine, and his descendants were the descendants of Jacob, peace be upon him. They all left Jacob, he did not leave alone. He left with all of them, and they all left Palestine. So how long did the children of Israel stay in Palestine? Not even a complete generation. In the generation of Jacob, peace be upon him, they were born and lived there, then they left those areas and went to Egypt. So how can they claim this land as theirs? These are fixed historical facts that are not up for debate. I didn't only refer to Arab references, but I also consulted the Holy Scriptures and Western history books, and all of them agree on this. So what right do they have to claim Palestine and say they were there before the Arabs? No, they were immigrants to it before and after and even later. When Moses, peace be upon him, migrated from Egypt, accompanied by the children of Israel, they migrated once again to Palestine. They always come as immigrants, while the original inhabitants of the land were the ones who came from the Arabian Peninsula. I have delved into this issue a little because some people, including Muslims, doubt that this land belonged to them before us. No, it was never their land. Those who came from the Arabian Peninsula are the original landowners, and they always came as immigrants. In the same year that Jacob established the temple, the Egyptian pharaohs began expanding their territories and occupied Palestine, particularly the areas they controlled. The Hyksos, who were Egyptians, took control, and Palestine became part of Egypt. Therefore, when a famine struck Palestine, they sought refuge in Egypt. They sought Egypt's assistance and support due to their historical ties, despite the vast desert of Sinai separating Palestine and Egypt. However, due to their administrative and political connection with Egypt, they sought Egypt's help to address the famine that befell them during the time of Jacob, peace be upon him. The children of Israel had no connection to Palestine, they lived in Egypt. The events in Palestine continued without the involvement of the children of Israel. In 13 BCE, peoples from the Mediterranean Sea, particularly the islands in the Mediterranean, including Crete, migrated. Crete is a well-known island on the maps, and the Muslims conquered it and established an Islamic kingdom there for 100 years. However, Crete was under Muslim control. This was before the advent of Islam. It seems that certain circumstances, such as famine, affected the tribes living in the Mediterranean Sea, causing them to migrate and attack the coasts of Syria and Egypt, eventually settling there. Ramesses Roman III began to confront them in the Battle of Luzon. It was a well-known battle in history with notable consequences. The battle took place between him and them because he did not want them to settle in Egypt. Negotiations were initiated, and they agreed not to inhabit Egypt but rather to go and settle in Palestine. So, they went to southern Palestine and declared that they would settle in areas that were not part of southern Palestine. This is clearly stated in historical books, written with the letters Ba, Lam, and Sin, which were pronounced as Palestine in their language at that time. However, this pronunciation differs from the present one. These people who migrated from the Mediterranean islands settled in Palestine and were called Palestinians. Hence, the name Palestine originated, and from there the term Palestinians became well known. Although they were immigrants, they became renowned in history and had a significant presence, especially in southern Palestine. Consequently, these regions, which were originally part of Canaan, became known as Palestinian territories and later transformed into Palestine over time. These migrating tribes that lived in southern Palestine found it to be a harsh desert, so they remained nomadic tribes without establishing a civilization. They began to spread throughout Palestine and started living with the Canaanites and the Japanese, Yabanan. Interethnic marriages occurred, leading to mixed lineages. The lineages became blended, and the people of these regions became known as Palestinians. With time, they completely assimilated into the Canaanites and the Buddhists, ultimately tracing their origin back to the Japanese Canaanites who came from the Arabian Peninsula. They began to worship the same deities as the Canaanites and adopted the Canaanite language. As a result, they completely merged, and afterward, they no longer had any historical presence or notable traces. the historical artifacts and mentions remained associated with the Canaanites and the Japanese. Thus, when the children of Israel returned to Palestine, they did not have any presence there anymore as they had settled in Egypt. Those who were called Palestinians had merged with the Canaanites and the Japanese who came from the Arabian Peninsula. So, where does the Jewish claim to Palestine stand?